Hello, I'm Suzette Field of A Curious Invitation. Welcome to the 32 Londoners podcast series. Along with Stephen Coates of Antique Beat, on May the 1st, I curated an extraordinary event on the EDF Energy London Eye. For one rotation, each of the Eye's 32 capsules was occupied by a speaker giving a talk about one of 32 significant born Londoners to a small audience. Here is Julien Temple on the musician Ray Davies.
Thank you so much for coming. I thought we'd have this beautiful Waterloo sunset to fly over, but it's the wrong month. But we've got a Kinks song for you that hopefully can set the scene. Did you hear that thunder there? There may be. It's quite a rare one, this one.
Misty shadow spread its wings, covered all the ground. Even though the sun was out, the rain came pouring down.
It's about the rain, and it's called A Rainy Day in June. It's a month out, but. And while this is playing, I'll just say, they said I had to talk about Ray Davies, but I am actually a fan of the Kinks. So I think Dave is just as important as Ray in this band. And I really like Mick Avery too, so I just want to point that out before I say anything else.
The skies so brilliant blue turned suddenly to grey. Cherished things are perishing and buried in their tomb. There is no hope, no reasoning, this rainy day in June.
Everybody's got the rain. We can fade it out gently now, that would be good. This is Caroline, by the way, who's an amazing editor who edits with me. So she's not just a tape op. I mean, the Kinks are something really personal to me because of my age, a venerable age that I am. I was old enough to be, under the sheets with a crystal set, we used to call them, which was like a primitive transistor radio. In the 64, when this happened to me, I was about 10 years old, and I was listening to, trying to get Radio Luxembourg as usual. It was kind of my parents said you're going to bed, but actually I was going to listen to whatever shit I could hear, and I was tuning in, and out of the ether, came You Really Got Me, which was really like, I'm not the only one to have felt this, but it was like some dirty nuclear bomb going off in your head under the sheets. And it was fading in and out, but it had, the power, the shamanic power of that rabid dog riff, It was like, at that time, everyone was sweet, It was like the Searchers, sugar and sweet. It was all like these kind of vibrating, ringing guitars. And suddenly there was this dry, roaring, shamanic destruction of that. And then there was the lyrics, which were about, not like the Beatles singing I Want to Hold Your Hand. This was a guy singing about the madness, the obsession of love. You really got me, to the extent, suicide was on the horizon. This was on the edge of madness, this song, and the breakdown in the middle of the guitar achieves fantastic madness. It's so good that they used to have to say that it was Jimmy Page who played it, but obviously it was Dave, who was 15 years old and knew what to do with the guitar, So that's my beginning of it. But then then I thought these guys are magical because they're more radical, they're more edgy than the Stones. They're just more hip. They look kind of weirder than anyone else. They had longer hair, or Dave did. And then I saw, I lived, I went to school near on Hampstead Heath, so one day I saw Ray on the street, and he was walking down Hampstead High Street. He was my hero, and I watched him come closer and closer. I thought, fuck, it's the chief Kink, And then he was like coming closer and closer. And I said, shit, he's crying. He was walking along like streaming tears. I talked later to one of his managers, said he must have lost a fiver on the street or something. But at that time I thought, how can a pop star that great be so unhappy? How can they be unhappy? I thought they had to be happy, So this was really intriguing to me, that this guy who was number one, was in floods of tears on Hampstead High Street. And I think that, Ray is that mixture of someone supremely confident and someone completely vulnerable and, unable to sleep. I know that now. I didn't know that then. So he's a magical mixture, which I think, informs all these songs, And then I learned more about the Kinks. I knew where they drink, So there was a special room which I loved at the school I was at, which had a pillar in front of a window. So if you got the seat by the pillar, you could climb out of the window without being noticed. So we would go off and go to this pub called the Flask, where the Kinks would drink, So I'd just watch them drink, watch the Kinks drink. It was all and I was getting all this amazing inspiration by just watching them drink from a distance, And then they, after a while, they would see us come back, and I got these pats on the top of my head from Ray. So I have a personal connection with them, and when I did work with them, it was a trip for me. We're not high enough up yet. Okay, and that thing of that shock power of the music. It wasn't just the Kinks. It was the Stones and the Small Faces and the Who. At that time, as a kid at school in London, you were in the middle of this music that was really seemed to be directed at you. It was like they were talking to young Londoners. They were making songs for the world of the city, and it was this fantastic connection to the songs that I felt that really changed the way I just saw everything. I thought my parents, what they're telling me is bullshit. My school is bullshit. I'm getting the truth from these weird radio waves, And I think I was right, and it was really great for a while, and they all fucked off to Hollywood and left us alone again for another 10 years until punk came along. The Kinks never did that. That's why I love them. They got banned as I don't know how many people know that, but the defining thing in the Kinks' trajectory was being banned from America, because unlike the Stones and the Beatles, they weren't really house trained. They weren't taught to piss in a pot, and they wouldn't cut their hair to go on the Ed Sullivan Show like the Rolling Stones. They said fuck off when they didn't want to do something. They were very punk-like before their time, and they were also very working class, unlike John Lennon or Mick Jagger, who were lower middle class. They were really singing from that side of the kind of class spectrum, which was hugely important at that time. So their voice was very different. They had, a very radical band, not just in the sound they created, but in the what underpinned their lyrics. Their father was very, very left-wing, left of Ken Livingstone by a long way. Left of Lenin, he used to claim. And there are funny things about some of their songs that can illustrate that. They were all very coded, but they were kind of rebel songs way before their time. And if you listen to them in the right way, there's a song called Tired of Waiting, which was #1 all over the world. In fact, Ray was I think he heard it was #1 in Malaysia. They just left Vietnam, where they were in the middle of the Vietnam War. Their plane was shot at and was diverted to somewhere in Malaysia, like the recent flight that went missing, I guess. And this Malaysian waiter told him it was #1 in America and in England with this song called Tired of Waiting. It was a worldwide hit. And he recorded that in '65, and he told me he hadn't written it. He'd written it 2 years earlier sitting on a frosty ledge on a freezing clear night on an attic ledge in Muswell Hill, where he sat up all night and wrote this song, sitting in the freezing cold, watching Yuri Gagarin go around the Earth, he claims. I mean, I don't know how he could see Yuri Gagarin. But he wrote this song called Tired of Waiting, which became called Tired of Waiting. But he didn't have any lyrics. He just had this killer riff. And, when they got him into the studio after You Really Got Me and All Day, All of the Night, these huge mega riff songs, they wanted to mix it up a bit, and Ray was saying, I've got this kind of calmer song called Tired of Waiting. And they said, okay, we'll record it. Where are the lyrics? He said, don't worry, I'll write the lyrics when we record it. I'll make them up. And Churchill was dying, waiting to die, and the whole nation was, holding their breath for the great man to die. And Ray wrote Tired of Waiting about Churchill dying. He wanted him to get on with it, and leave the 19th century behind. I don't know, some of these things you have to take with a pinch of salt, but they do reveal things. I guess I am talking about Ray more than anyone else, but clearly, and I think because we're in the London Eye, you see that one dot of light there, that's Alexandra Palace. That one little dot above the skyline, which is somewhere in the direction of Muswell Hill and Highgate and all that. And I think part of, Ray is a great Londoner, like probably all the other Londoners that are being talked about tonight. But he did live above London, above the smog. There was a big issue with the smog. So Ray could see the sun when the rest of us, below the smog line couldn't see it. In fact, I was born in the great smog of whenever I was born. It was killing loads of people. And I was a baby and they wouldn't let me out for like 3, I was born in Fulham down that way, but they wouldn't let babies out because they were dying in this smog. Meanwhile, Ray was sitting quite happily in Muswell Hill above the smog. And I think he's always had this way of seeing London that comes from, the heights of Highgate and North London. I find North London a kind of weird place personally, but I do know it's higher than other parts of London. And I think that does inform his songs. I think he's also a troubled, fucked up genius in many ways. There's a dark side to Ray that I think makes everything he's done, more interesting than people who don't explore that. I think he's consistently allowed himself to explore the contradictions of having a great day and then having a pretty bad day. And I have seen, the effect of that is quite powerful on him. Dave said, Ray had 3 happy years in his life before I was born, which is probably true. I mean, Dave seems to speak the truth, actually. Ray was born at the end of the war in a family, a huge extended working class family that had been pushed out of Islington, more of the inner city, up to Muswell Hill. There was this kind of purging of inner city areas of the working class even then. And, Muswell Hill bit is actually about that process. The great Kinks album about their identity, really. So at the beginning of the war, they were all up in Muswell Hill, in a tiny little terraced house in Muswell Hill, and Ray was the 7th child, which is kind of magic number. there were 6 sisters, going back to 1920, I think the eldest sister was born. But this incredible legion of sisters. So the arrival of the 7th child, the first son, and it happened at the end of the war, is when all this stuff was feeding into this family that, after 6 years of this war, finally the peace was going to be won. You're going to get rid of Churchill, you're going to elect a Labour government, you're going to have a national health service, you're going to change the world, you're going to create somewhere new. And this child, Ray, for this family, seemed to symbolize this moment, this hope. And he was like the apple of their eye. And it was one of those families where, after the pub on the Saturday night, the piano in the front room is the magical space that allows the Kinks to create, whenever they enter that space. And they used to go back there, having had 10 number 1 hits, they would still go and work up the songs in this tiny front room. So you got this wonder boy. He wrote a song about it, inheriting the earth. In 1945, there's a beautiful Humphrey Jennings film called Diary for Timothy, about a boy like Ray who's born at the end of the war, and it imagines this future in this great Labour socialist Britain for this boy. And I think, all those guys from the 60s come from that generation. I think you have to look at whether you're looking at John Lennon or you're looking at Keith Richards or Ray Davies. It's a very powerful moment that they were born in. And they all went to art schools that came out of that war, and they probably had healthier lives because of the NHS. Anyway, in this front room after the pub on a Saturday night, the sing-along was the thing, so you got 17 people living in this house, mothers-in-law, fathers-in-law, the sisters were all married. It was a crazy tribal gathering. And the big thing was to sing around the piano, and little Ray would come and perform for this loving audience, doting audience, until 3 years later, this bizarre event happened. Ray's mother who's a wonderful woman called Annie, was a rather large lady, very large. So she was pregnant, but no one knew she was pregnant. She was too big for anyone to guess what was going on. She didn't tell anyone. So again, in this magical space of the front room, one night Dave popped out. And Ray had absolutely no idea that this was going to happen. No one did. And it was on a drunken Saturday night, I believe. So this event was seared into Ray's mind. Suddenly there's a rival, there's someone else, And I think it came true that the family gravitated to the next younger kid. And so 3 years later, young Dave was in front of the piano doing the strut, and young Ray was peering in through the keyhole from the dark stairway outside the magical space of the living room. So I do think you have to see the drama of the Kinks and the creative collisions that made the Kinks great. You have to base it you have to understand it from the source of this strange childhood. The fighting got so bad that the kids in this overcrowded house had to be sent away to various sisters. Ray went to a middle-class sister, and Dave went to a very working-class sister with a black kid of her own, a mixed race kid of her own. So they had very different, periods of adolescence, but they came back together in this band, in the middle of that R&B boom where the Stones came out of, and the Who and all those other great bands from London at that time. The Who were considered the butch man's Kinks, I think, at the time, because there was always a great kind of gender bender aspect to the Kinks. Yeah, he's a great observer. That image of him looking in through the front room keyhole is a way of seeing the way he saw London. Part of it, but also kind of outside it. And I think that slightly distanced perspective, unlike bands like the Beatles, if something fashionable was happening, they'd jump on the bandwagon and become hippies or whatever you needed to be in that next state. The Kinks were very, kind of rooted in their working classness, and when everyone was taking LSD, I think the best thing, there's a great quote, it was like, the heaven for the Kinks is, Sunday roast and a pint of beer, fuck the LSD kind of thing. They had this distance that I think comes from Ray's, looking in and observing things, and that made him write in the third person. He doesn't really write, his best songs are often inhabiting other people's perspectives. If you look at Waterloo Sunset or Sunny Afternoon, it's not him, he's singing as a character. Long before Bowie, the character in Sunny Afternoon is a different character. And of course David Bowie, because of the gender bending thing, was down the front row of all those early Kinks gigs, picking up on every movement that Ray would make, So I thought I'd say that. I was going to play See My Friends here, which is about that sexual confusion. We have a great river here. Do we have any reception? No? But there is this song, about friends playing across the river, which is again very coded about being bisexual, really. I'm talking, most people talk about Ray's lyrics, but I think he was, the Kinks and Ray were much more than just, probably the most intelligent lyric writers of that period. They were shapers of attitudes and sounds, and inspired other genres of music in a way that no other British band has done. I mean, obviously, You Really Got Me launched heavy rock, hard rock, the 60s dry, raw guitar sound that degenerated, in my eyes, into heavy metal, which I hate, comes from the Kinks. So let's celebrate that. Obviously, the punk attitude, if you hear You Need Me or some of those raw guitar-driven songs, I mean, Dave's whole attitude was punk rock 10 years before. I touched on the fact that the Rolling Stones would do what they were told and the Kinks wouldn't. They were banned from America for, fighting with promoters who wouldn't pay them, beating up union guys, who extorted them, mafia guys, I mean, the big thing about the British invasion, it was an attack on the Hollywood music establishment, or the American music establishment, the Rat Pack, these long-haired guys, from Britain, pansies, faggots, coming and playing this black music, playing the blues, playing rhythm and blues. This was anathema to Dean Martin and Frank Sinatra. They hated it, and they couldn't. There's a great show with Dean Martin pissed out of his mind with the Rolling Stones on his show, where if you look at that on YouTube, you'll get the idea. But their kingdom was being destroyed by this British invasion, and they couldn't fuck with the Beatles because they were, protected and had great management, and they were squeaky clean basically at that point, above the surface. The private public thing was, the Kinks had no division between the image and what the real thing was. The Beatles had a big difference, as did the Stones, and Oldham was a very clever manipulator. The Kinks had these two guys from the city over there somewhere, City of London, have you heard of that? These two upper class twits or twats or whatever you, bankers basically, who had no idea about rock and roll. It's a very funny story because one of them, they were called Robert and Grenville, and Robert is now an equerry to the Queen actually. These are the guys who managed the Kinks in the 60s. They had no clue. Robert wanted to be they used to play he wanted to play debutante balls and hunt balls. And he thought he was kind of Buddy Holly and he needed a backing band. And somehow he heard of these oiks called the Ravens or whatever they're called. He got them to be their backing band, the Kinks. So they started out playing all these marquees in, you know, Herefordshire and Wiltshire, you know, very tough events, backing this very wealthy aristocratic guy who would, in his pinstripe suit, would do kind of Buddy Holly impersonation. And one day he got so fired up by Rave On, tell me, like he was swinging the mic around, he smashed himself in the face and he broke all his teeth. And he was like spitting teeth and blood and had to leave the stage in this pinstripe suit. And the band were just like, well, what the fuck do we do now? And Dave pushed Ray to the front, and he had to carry on the song. And then they realized, well, we can be a band on our own. But these guys had no fucking clue, and they got the Kinks banned from America for 4.5 years. They just had 3 top 10 hits, more than the Stones. They were, you know, second after the Beatles. But the Rat Pack needed a sacrificial lamb, and they went after the Kinks, and they said, like God said to Satan, you know, get out of paradise or whatever. And they were banned right through the second half of the 60s. So their place was taken by the Who, basically. They were invited to Monterey and to Woodstock, but they couldn't go. And you need to understand that, because Ray had this very ambivalent feeling about America. He's a very paranoid guy on some levels. But maybe he was right. You know, he was freaked out by the assassination of Kennedy. He didn't want to go on the first American tour. He thought they were all serial killers and gun owners and assassins. And bizarrely, you know, 50 years later, he was right. He got shot in New Orleans. He was right to be worried about guns, but he didn't want to go on that first American tour, and he had a very kind of ambivalent attitude to it. And he was right, because they kicked him out, and he turned his back on America, which had been, like the Stones and the Who and the Small Faces, the blues, the black music of America had turned them all on. And You Really Got Me is a kind of London blues song. He was the first London writer to make the blues his own. You know, the Stones played the blues brilliantly, but they played covers for years and years and years, until Andrew Loog Oldham locked them in a room and said, you've got to write, we're not going to make any money unless you write your own fucking songs, you know. But Ray had been doing that way before, and You Really Got Me, All Day Over the Night, these are London versions of the blues. But he had to turn his back on that kind of love affair with America and reinvent himself when he was thrown out of America in an English way, which gave us all these great mid-60s, late 60s, that period where he wrote, you know, Well-Respected Man, Dedicated Follower of Fashion, Sunny Afternoon, Dead End Street, Waterloo Sunset. Many other great songs were saying, fuck that, I'll reconnect with my roots, and I'll sing about what's important to me and my family, and I'll sing about what he called the great generation, his parents and his grandparents who lived through the First World War, the Depression of the 30s, the Second World War, these great survivors who survived and fought to create, you know, to elect a Labour government in the 40s and have the only really seismic change we've ever had in our political landscape was created by those people. And he saw through Swinging London. Although they were part of it, they were mercilessly satirizing it, and the way he wrote Dedicated Follower of Fashion is funny. There was I think his wife would like to have been more involved in Swinging London, so there was a Christmas party where the Kinks were on Ready Steady Go singing All I Want for Christmas Is My Two Front Teeth, you know, that song. Anyway, they had all the hairdressers and designers up, and to Ray's, you know, Muswell Hill house. I mean, he never really left Muswell Hill. That's quite interesting about him. When, you know, the Beatles went from Liverpool to mansions in Surrey, and The Stones went to Cheyne Walk. The Kinks stayed where they came from. But this party ended up in some hairdresser had an argument with Ray, which ended up in a fight, and this guy was thrown out. And Ray sat down and wrote Dedicated Fashion, Follower of Fashion, after this fisticuff situation that was deeply embarrassing, because the whole of Swinging London was there, apparently. But he never really believed in Swinging London, which I really understand, because I've done a lot of research of film images of London, at that time, and you see, how decaying and decayed London was, and people were living in this incredible slum-like way, and that facade of Swinging London didn't reach most of London. And I think the great thing was that Ray was able to turn away from the kind of glamour of huge success in the States and actually look at our culture, behind the facade, in a way that the other bands of that time forgot how to do, lost, and became more obsessed with glamour in America and a kind of jet set lifestyle that inevitably alienates you and distances you from your audience. No, he wrote a song called Big Sky. Do you know that song? Which he wrote at the Cannes Film Festival, and he was looking down from the top of some big hotel. It's all about the business deals and the kind of bullshit going on down below, and it's a very funny song. I'm going to have a drink.
Big sky on down, all the people looking up at the big sky. Everybody's pushing one another around. The big sky feels sad when you see the children scream and cry. For the big sky too big to let it get him down. Big sky too big.
What do you think of Village Green? Because that kind of killed the Kinks, but I think it's a great album, isn't it? But,
I think all their great albums sold nothing. Something Else is a great album. Yeah. Village Green is an amazing album. It's in the tradition of Orwell and Dylan Thomas. It's a great exploration of the English psyche, and it's also a great anti-Vietnam War album. So I love it, and I think you can relate that exactly to like the square mile where Ray lives still and came from, which includes that bit of Hampstead Heath, includes Waterloo Park. It's that Cherry something Park, I can't remember the name, but all these parks which are, and those places are villages. Muswell Hill was a village, Highgate was a village. They still are in a way, and I think it shows an incredible melodic composing prowess as well. I mean, it's as good as anything the Beatles wrote on a kind of musical level, but it has this edge of really acidic wit that the Beatles never really achieved, Yeah.
Okay, so that quote by Damon Albarn about like the Rolling Stones being pornographic and the Kinks being geographic.
The Kinks, what a name! Isn't that a pornographic name? The Rolling Stones seems a bit academic, like an old bluesologist might.
What do you reckon that Ray really thinks about modern London now in terms of a realm of inspiration?
I think honestly though, maybe, his songs that he wrote, it's very hard to write better songs now. I think there was such a collision between that time and that music, and if you were young in that time, reacting to the blues in London at that time, there was a very special energy that someone like Damon Albarn tried to get and didn't really get, and it was easier in the 90s than it is now. I think it needs reinventing totally. You've got to reinvent London. You've got to reinvent the music, because London's dying. We should have looked when we were up high. We could have looked at Chelsea. All the lights would have been out, and the oligarchs' houses. It's like a dead area of London. We should be looking over at Leytonstone where it's jumping. This strange effect. which should be their new single when we do this. I'm doing a movie about them, drama, but it's a great song that was never released by the Kinks. It's only on a BBC session that they played it. They gave it to this guy called Dave Berry, who used to wrap himself up like bondage guy in his microphone, doing all this and going around his neck and he was great as well, but their version is obviously much better than his version because they were real Kinks. Thank you. Let's celebrate them. There are, London.
Thanks for listening. 32 Londoners was sponsored by Hendrick's Gin, who created 32 unique cocktails, one for each capsule and one for each London borough. To hear more talks and for more information on 32 Londoners, go to 32londoners.com. Or, for more information on Antique Beat and A Curious Invitation and the other events we create, go to www.antiquebeat.co.uk or acuriousinvitation.com.